The night shift. James was a college student, working the night shift at a 24-hour convenience store to help pay for tuition. The job was boring, but the pay was decent, and it gave him plenty of time to study, or at least, that was the plan. The store was located on the outskirts of town, surrounded by nothing but woods and the occasional passing car. It was a Thursday night, or rather, early Friday morning, around 2 a.m. James had just finished restocking the shelves and was sitting behind the counter, flipping through his notes for an upcoming exam. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the otherwise silent store. That's when the door chimed. James looked up, expecting to see one of the regulars, maybe a trucker stopping for coffee, or a late-night traveler grabbing snacks for the road. But there was no one there. The door had opened, but no one had walked in. He frowned, got up, and walked around the counter to take a look. The automatic door slid shut behind him. He leaned outside, peering into the darkness, but saw nothing. Just the empty parking lot and the dark line of trees beyond it. Must have been the wind, he muttered to himself, though the air outside was completely still. He shrugged it off and went back to his seat, trying to focus on his notes. Minutes passed, and just as James started to get back into his studying, the lights flickered. The overhead bulbs buzzed louder for a moment, then returned to normal. James glanced up at them, a slight shiver running down his spine. He'd worked enough night shifts to know that this place had its quirks: flickering lights, doors that didn't close properly, the occasional power surge. But it was usually quiet at this hour. As the minutes ticked by, James couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. He kept glancing at the door, expecting someone to walk in. The air in the store felt heavier, charged with something he couldn't quite put his finger on. Then, the door chimed again. This time, James didn't look up right away. He told himself it was just another fluke, that it would shut on its own in a few seconds. But when he finally glanced up, his breath caught in his throat. Standing just inside the entrance was a man. He was tall, wearing an old-fashioned suit that looked out of place in the modern store. His face was obscured by the brim of a hat, and his hands were tucked into his pockets. James stared, waiting for the man to move, to walk up to the counter, to do anything. But the man just stood there, unmoving. Can I help you?" James called out, trying to keep his voice steady. The man didn't respond. He didn't move. The door slid shut behind him with a soft click, but he didn't seem to notice. James felt his pulse quicken. Something was very wrong. He couldn't explain it, but there was something about the man that set off alarm bells in his mind. Still, he couldn't just ignore him. "Sir?" James tried again, more forcefully this time. The man finally moved. He lifted his head slightly, just enough for James to see his eyes, cold, dark eyes that seemed to bore into his soul. The man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Only malice. Before James could react, the lights flickered again, this time plunging the store into momentary darkness. The buzzing of the lights grew louder, more frantic, and then, just as quickly as it had started, everything went silent. The lights came back on, and the man was gone. James blinked, his heart racing. He looked around the store, half expecting to see the man standing in one of the aisles, but he was alone. The store was empty. James stood up, his legs shaky, and walked to the door. He stepped outside into the cold night air, looking left and right, but there was no sign of the man. No car in the parking lot. No footsteps on the pavement. Just the darkness of the woods beyond. He went back inside, locking the door behind him. He could barely concentrate on his notes now, his mind racing with what he'd just seen. He tried to convince himself that it was a trick of the light, that he was just tired and had imagined the whole thing. But he couldn't shake the feeling that the man was still out there, watching him. For the next hour, James sat behind the counter, too afraid to move, his eyes darting to every shadow, every flicker of light. The store was quiet again, but the silence was suffocating. He kept glancing at the clock, willing the minutes to pass faster, desperate for his shift to end. Then, at 3 a.m., the door chimed one last time. James froze. He didn't want to look, didn't want to see what had walked in this time. But he couldn't stop himself. Slowly, he lifted his head, and his blood ran cold. The man was back. Standing in the exact same spot, in the exact same position, as if he'd never left. But this time, he wasn't alone. Behind him stood more figures, all dressed in old-fashioned clothes, their faces obscured by shadows. There were men, women, even children, all staring at James with those same cold, dark eyes. James stumbled back, his breath coming in short gasps. He wanted to run, but his legs wouldn't move. The lights began to flicker again, the buzzing growing louder, more intense, as the figures began to move toward him. The last thing James saw before the lights went out completely was the man's twisted smile, and then everything went black. When the morning shift arrived, they found the store empty. The lights were still on, the door was still locked, but there was no sign of James. His belongings were left behind, and the security footage showed nothing but static from 2:30 a.m. onwards. The police searched the area, but they found no clues, no trace of what had happened. James had simply vanished, just like the man in the old suit and his ghostly companions. To this day, the store remains open, and night shifts are still assigned. But after what happened to James, no one stays past 2 a.m. And those who have worked the night shift since all report the same thing, an eerie feeling, like they're being watched, and the occasional flicker of the lights, accompanied by the soft chime of the door, when no one is there.